Okay, dokes, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. I will call the meeting of the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program to order. I guess it's our RAC meeting, our Rules Advisory Committee. And I want to welcome everybody this afternoon. It's a good day to get in an air-conditioned room and hash our way through this stuff. I know if I wasn't here, I would be outside working, and I was a little while ago, and it's hot. So, with that being said, I think we should go through introductions, and I'm Doug Kramer, and I'm chair of our program, but not the RAC group, not the RAC committee.
Good distinction.
Okay, so who wants to be next?
I can just call on people. Nicole.
I wasn't prepared for that. Hello, everyone. Nicole Bettinardi. I am the exec assistant here at OWEB.
Thanks. Teresa.
Hi, Teresa DeBartoleben, the Drought Program Specialist. I'm here to support Taylor and Robin and take notes.
Great. Eric.
Good afternoon, Eric Hartstein, Policy Coordinator at OWEB.
You, Amanda.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Lowe. I'm the OAHC Tribal Representative appointed by OWEB.
Thanks. Ellen.
I'm Ellen Ingemels. I'm the new Grant Support Specialist here at OWEB.
Great. Renee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Renee Davis, Acquisitions and Special Programs Manager at OWEB.
Thanks. Robin.
Hi, everyone. Robin Meacher. I'm the Conservation Easement Specialist for the OAHP at OWEB.
Cool. Lois.
I'm Lois Loop, appointed by the Oregon Ag Commission to handle things associated with water.
Great. Bruce.
I'm Bruce Taylor, and I'm the Commission Vice Chair and a member of the RAC.
Thanks. Ed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ed Contreras, Commissioner representing Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Ed. Barbara.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Barbara Boyer, and I am the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Liaison to this RAC.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Nancy.
Hi there. I'm Nancy Duncrack. I'm the DLCD representative on the commission with expertise in conservation easements.
Awesome. Laura.
Hi, everybody. Laura Masterson, organic vegetable farmer appointed by ODA to be an ag rep.
Had to have you. And Stephanie.
Good afternoon. Stephanie Page, Deputy Director at OWEB.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then I'm Taylor Larson. I'm the coordinator for the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program here at OWEB. And if you can tell, I'm trying to get this meeting going here because we got a lot to get through. So we are here at our second Rule Advisory Committee meeting. At our first meeting, we tackled Division 5, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes kind of revisiting what we did there. And, you know, as I'm running through Division 5, feel free to stop for clarifying questions. There's still going to be a few open questions. It's not like this is going to be the final draft. But just wanted to re-ground us in what we did last time. And then we're going to turn it over to Robin, who's going to walk us through Division 15, which is the rule set dealing with our Conservation Covenant and Easement Program. And so we'll spend the bulk of our time here up until 4 o'clock working on those rules. We'll stop a little bit before 4 o'clock for public comment, at which point, after we take public comment, we'll wrap up, and then it'll be the end of this meeting. And then we'll magically move into another meeting from 4 to 5, which will be the commission business meeting. So before I dive into our rule set, are there questions about process or requests for doing things in a different way? Just want to make sure I'm not bulldozing people here because I do want to move through Division 5 pretty quick. Okay, oh, seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And okay, I'm assuming we can all see that. I can zoom in a little bit, make it bigger, take rid of this ribbon, and end up back up here at Division 5. Okay, so Division 5, these are our administrative rules. So they touch all 4 of the other rule sets in that they govern kind of the program as a whole, and then each grant program has its own rule set. And so we're going to be revisiting what we did here in Division 5 and then moving pretty quickly into Division 15. So we talked a fair amount at our last meeting about the purpose of the program. And we did make a suggested edit. The main suggested edit here is on number 3. So it used to read the enhancement of fish and wildlife, habitat, water quality, and other natural resources on Oregon's working land. And so in order to better align with statute, we added the maintenance or enhancement of fish and wildlife, water quality, and other natural resources. We did have a discussion about thinking about if increased economic viability needed to be a part of every project and whether or not we potentially wanted to change that to increased economic resiliency. But my takeaway from that last conversation is we didn't come down strong on a change to the purpose, and thus I've left it as is for now. But I do think this is something we can be coming back to at any point in time before we're finished with the rule set. I mean, this is, I think, after we spend some time with Division 15, potentially Division 10 with our CMP rules, we might have some better ideas as to how to best articulate the purpose of the program. And so I just want to put a pin in this and say that it's not done, but this is where it stands now. So if anybody does want to dive into this at the moment, raise your hand or let me know. Otherwise, just know we will come back to it. This isn't set in stone. Cool. Okay. So then we added some definitions for the climate criteria. We moved the definition of CMP, Conservation Management Plan holder, to Division 10. We talked about the use or the reference to land use statute in some of our definitions of what accepted farming practices are and what we mean by farming and ranching. And I made a note here that we were going to come back and revisit this after our discussion about Division 15, the conservation easement rules. It might shed some more light on whether or not reference to land use is the appropriate way for us to be defining our terms. So again, that's another place we're putting a pin in it. We will be back to that at some point. And then we moved the definition of management plan down into Division 15, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. Similarly here, land use statute, we're going to revisit that. Under application requirements. Oh, sorry, Renee, you had a question.
Yeah, just really quickly, Taylor, because we blasted by it. You mentioned climate criteria, and just as a reminder, I think all of the commission members were on last call, but I'm not remembering who was and was not in attendance. So these are climate criteria adopted by the OWEB board, and as part of their adoption of those climate criteria after an extensive outreach process and rulemaking process, the expectation from the board was that these would essentially be perpetuated through all OWEB grant programs, including engagement with the Ag Heritage Commission in determining how to incorporate the climate criteria into the OAHP rules. So just wanted to remind folks of that piece. That's based on extensive discussion with the OWEB board about their climate criteria, rather than just an insertion from a staff perspective. Thanks, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks for that, Renee. And all context questions can be directed at Bruce, who participated in the process. So he's our local expert on it. Okay, then under the application requirements, we just had a few deletions to simplify the amount of requirements we have for an application. just because it felt like that didn't necessarily need to be in rule. And so we're doing that. And then we moved number 3, applications will be considered complete as submitted, down to application processing. So here it is down in application processing. And then we went ahead and deleted the second rule, which would then have been the third rule in application processing, that the commission may require additional information to aid in evaluating grant projects. And so the reasoning here, if you remember, was that right above it, we say applications are considered complete as submitted. And so it's a bit of a contradictory rule. But the preceding rule does give some wiggle room that the commission and staff can request clarifying information. So we can't get new information, but we can get clarifying information. So then moving down here, we entered a new section for the climate evaluation criteria. And that is the same criteria that is Renee just referenced, that's being used also in other OWEB grant programs across the board. Then we just had a few minor tweaks here about which body is doing what. We removed number 6 here under grant agreement conditions. We aren't necessarily providing expense forms, and so it just gives us a little more flexibility, not to say that they have to use our form. Distribution of funds, again, just some tweaks about which entity is doing what. We talked about these last time. We did remove this section, funding decision reconsiderations by the board, per our discussion last time. And then we deleted a part of a sentence here in the technical committees, just referencing specifically conservation management plans and working land conservation covenants and easements, and made this technical committee section speak to all 4 grant programs, which I think just makes it more useful and clear. And then that's it. So that was the whirlwind tour through suggested edits to the Division 5. We can send out a clean version of this preceding our next meeting, so you can see it without all the markup. And like I said, there's a few aspects in Division 5 that we'll be coming back to, including the purpose and some of our definitions. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through Division 15. And before we do, are there any questions, thoughts about process before we dive into the deep end here with Robin and the easement program? Okay, well, here we go. So Robin, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through, but I can keep sharing my screen, and we'll just start from the top.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. So as Taylor just noted, we're kind of working off of different screens. So please don't hesitate to just kind of unmute yourself and ask if you start to get confused about where we are in the document that you're looking at, since we are kind of trying to stay the same, but might be a little bit off at points. And before we dive into kind of these first edits, I think it's just helpful for everyone to get an idea of where staff were coming from as we approached the edits and the suggested changes to these. And a big part of it was looking back at our statute and trying to make sure that our rules are aligning with the statutory language when an item is directly addressed, and then bringing that kind of throughout the rule set of just making sure we're referring and making sure that if something is addressed in the statute, that we're bringing it back to the rule set and really trying to be compatible between those two rather than having conflicts in our rules with what our statutory language says. And then another kind of guiding principle that we used was just trying to make sure that roles were clear. As we went through it, there's a lot of reference to the commission, the board, OWEB. And so we just wanted to be clear as we were going through in processes and how things are referenced, that we're referring to the appropriate body, either because the statute speaks to it or just in terms of how OWEB works as an agency, and then just process in general, what works best. And then another part was trying to reduce areas of confusion throughout kind of how projects are administered and how the program is just working on the ground. And so you'll notice when we get to the evaluation criteria that there was quite a bit of edits to that. And so we will switch over to a cleaner version of that at the outset when we get there, just so we can kind of look at it in both ways, hopefully making the presentation of that better. So with those kind of setting it up, I think it is helpful that we start kind of in this purpose, because in the last one, as Taylor mentioned in Division 5, we talk about the purpose of kind of the overall OHP program and this rule set that governs all. And so this kind of narrows it down into what is the purpose of the Working Lands Conservation Covenant and Grants program. And so we do have statutory language that specifically speaks to what the purpose of an easement or covenant funded under this program is. So we made some edits suggested here that basically just take that statutory language and insert it. And part of that is just, again, we have a statute that directly speaks to what the purpose of these grants and these easements that are funded under these grants need to be. And so our suggestion is that we match that rather than kind of having two different purposes between our statutory language and our rule set. So with that, if folks want to have a discussion about that, I think it's a good place to kind of talk about what are these grants funding and ground us back into that statute a little bit if needed, but otherwise we can kind of move through that. And I can only see about 3 of you, so.
I see Bruce's hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, Robin, will a conservation easement typically state the purpose of the easement in terms like this, or how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So typically conservation easements will state a more specific purpose. So it'll be more specifically tailored to the property and the goals of that easement in itself. They do have purpose statements, which are really valuable because a purpose statement is essentially, and purpose statements are essentially referenced throughout the easement document as kind of being the guiding principle when trying to interpret a term that may or may not be clear. So yes, purpose statements are often, and particularly an easement that has a funding program like ours, this would be part of what we would want to see in that easement, as this is the purpose of this grant. Any other thoughts on that? Or we can always come back to it too as we're kind of working through the rest of these to see if anyone has any connections that they want to kind of work through. So I think we can move down into definitions. So there's not a lot of suggested edits here, but we did want to have some conversation about kind of what we've put in here. So as Taylor mentioned, we moved management plan into the definitions for this program, since the term management plan is utilized in this program, the Conservation Covenants and Easements program, whereas the other program, the Conservation Management Plans, is its own defined term. So it wasn't particularly appropriate to have a management plan. It was confusing to have management plan defined in Division 5 that was kind of reflective of the entire program, where we have these two programs that kind of speak to them similarly but different. So that was kind of our purpose for bringing it into this division's definitions rather than leaving it in Division 5. And then, so we have it there. So as this division refers to management plan later on, this would be that definition that we would go to. And then some minor edits into just kind of doing the appropriate reference to the rule division. And then I think we can talk about 3 and 4 at the same time. So this is kind of this is in reference to stewardship and a stewardship fund. So the program currently, under the allowable use of grant funds, we do have a contribution to a stewardship fund. And so the stewardship fund is here defined in rules. And then that kind of is directly tied to what do we mean by stewardship. So we thought it was a good space to kind of revisit the concept and definition of stewardship in the context of a conservation easement program, where the funds from the program are being provided to a holder of a conservation easement who typically their role is to monitor and basically provide enforcement actions and then resolving violations. Some of these other items mentioned in stewardship in an easement context are more appropriately held by the landowner because they are the everyday manager of the property. They are the ones that work it, and they are the ones that are essentially signing up to maintain, manage, and improve the land to the goals of that easement. And so we did want to talk a little bit about the differentiation between what a holder's typical responsibility is and what stewardship in the context of a conservation easement is typically considered. And that's also kind of in line with what the Land Trust Alliance refers to as stewardship when it comes to conservation easements, and just have a conversation about whether we should adjust this definition to rein it in to be more in line with what the holder is actually doing regarding the easement versus what stewardship of the land itself would look like.
So this is Doug Kramer. I guess a little bit of a question or maybe more of a comment, but under the management plan and the stewardship, I know one of the things that is a sticking point on some of our easements that we're trying to get through right now is that our management plan and or maybe stewardship is expectations are different than what they are for NRCS. And of course, NRCS is part of the funder and we're part of the funder. Is there a way to, and probably not in these rules, but in the deal for the in the grant application itself, can we make those more in line with NRCS? And would this be the place to do it, or is it in the application itself?
I can respond to that. I don't know, Ed, if you wanted to,
please
if your
do.
comments
Yes.
are similar, or just I can.
Mine was concerning.
Nancy might have a comment on that too. I don't know.
My comment was in regards to the defining stewardship here and the definition of stewardship.
Yeah, so I think it's might be helpful for us to kind of explain how the program utilizes management plans currently and our understanding of how NRCS utilizes management plans for their funding. So currently we require a management plan to be referenced in the conservation easement document. That management plan is developed by the holder of the conservation easement and the landowner. OWEB provides kind of initial review and approval during the drafting stage of that management plan prior to closing. And then once the easement is in place, the management plan is essentially administered between the holder of the conservation easement and the landowner. And then any updates to the management plan would come to OWEB as a courtesy for review. And then we would essentially, if we had any concerns about what is included in the management plan, we have an obligation to get back to the land trust or the holder over a certain time frame. So that's how we've approached it. Currently, we are asking all easement projects to have a management plan. We're not differentiating between, what comes in the door. We're just making it something that is across the board a requirement. And then our understanding for NRCS, so NRCS is one of our match funders, the most, I'd say prevalent match funder, though we do have other funding sources for match. NRCS has management plan requirements for certain enrollment types. So if a project is enrolling in the NRCS or seeking funds through the NRCS program for a certain type of designation, then they would be required to do a management plan that addresses those resources. I believe that is in the grasslands of special significance and in highly erodible cropland. And then all enrollees or folks looking to enroll can choose to do an agricultural land easement plan of their own accord. They can do that at the beginning of their application and check a box and say, we are going to do this. And then they would essentially be obligated to do that plan as they went through their grant. So a little bit of a difference in that NRCS has kind of the specifics of when they require, and we just have it required across the board. So I don't know if definitions is, I mean, I think we're talking about.
This is Laura. I have a question. Is
Yeah.
the management plan required, excuse me, for OWEB in the statute or just in the rule?
So the management plan is not required in statute or rule. That is a policy choice by OWEB staff at the outset of the program, based off of the inclusion of management plan references throughout the rules, both in the evaluation criteria and then also in other places. So it's not addressed in either. It's how we have administered the program.
Okay, I'll just say at the Conservation District, we have gotten away from the management plans and just sort of been much more clean about we're requiring folks to do something in the easement, not adding a management plan on top of it. And then if we're going to, if there is some desire for additional conservation uplift, then we do that through another program, not a management plan. So I think that might be a significant change, but that's one I certainly would support.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Laura. And then Ed, I don't want to skip over you, but you still want to talk about stewardship, or do you have something on management plan?
No, that was, yeah, I haven't gotten to my comment about the stewardship definition. Just looking through the division and the rest of the document, where else is stewardship used aside from stewardship fund? I think that might give us some clarity on whether we even want to have a definition related to that.
Well, it is used in the definition of management plan. So then we
Okay.
get into a circular situation.
Missed that one.
Yeah.
I think it might be also in thought it was also referenced in one of the evaluation criteria regarding capacity, but I might be steward is referenced in capacity, but
Okay,
Bruce?
we can keep going.
Yep.
It was
Okay.
for
Well,
a
Bruce, do you
discussion
have
item,
something to
so-
add?
Yes, I would, I agree with Laura, I think, but just to clarify, does the appraisal include what's the terms of the management plan? I mean, are we actually paying for the right to dictate to approve a management plan? And if it's not part of the valuation, I'm definitely more inclined to go Laura's route.
So great question. Appraisers will ask to see management plans. I think the important part to consider is what level is the management plan adding additional obligations to the landowner that would be of the nature that could have a value impact. So we as a program and as OWEB are not making a determination either way that the management plan has to be incorporated into the valuation. That's the appraiser's job essentially, is to determine what the terms of the easements and how they impact the value. I think that it is a good space to talk about, though, what the purpose of the management plan for the program could be. And if it's to kind of direct management to the extent that it could have an impact of that level on an appraisal, then I think we need to be more considered as how that's approached. Currently, the management plan is utilized as a communication tool and a descriptive document, not an additional prescription. And so we have not seen any appraisals yet and how the appraisers are working through them, but we do know it's been a question raised by appraisers as they've gone through the process.
Renee?
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. So, Robin, given what you just described and given what Laura mentioned in terms of how the district handles things, what path is then used for more of that iterative communication? And Laura, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. You're like, tell us about your process. But I think just understanding, given the conversation we're having about management plans, what does that look like for the communication to be assured? And I think my follow-up question is, does that then result in an easement that is more prescriptive, absent a management plan?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the management plans, well, I feel like stuff is getting conflated here, because in the easement, you have the requirement for documentation. I mean, whatever we're paying for and whatever the appraiser is doing, I mean, whatever the conservation easement holder is required to do is in the easement. So, and for us, the management plan isn't even done until after the appraisal. So I don't think that it could be part of the appraisal, nor should it be, because the management plan, the way I've seen them work the best, which is not, they can be, anyway, we found them to be onerous and complicated, because oftentimes the expectation is somebody's required to do something, they're not being paid for it. It's like outside the easement, but somehow it's wrapped into the easement. So at the district, that's why we've really been moving towards separating those two things. What the conservation uplift that we're getting and that we're paying for is in the easement, and the annual conservation that we want to encourage people to do is outside of the easement. So anyway, I think there are a variety of ways to communicate with folks. I would hope that communication is happening. It wouldn't need a management plan to communicate that. So that's where we're headed. I mean, your baseline documentation report is part of what tells you the property condition and, what will change or not change in the easement.
Thanks, Laura.
And this is Doug again. I guess, when we put these rules together, at least from my perspective, a management plan was simply describing how you're going to carry out agriculture. And I'm not sure any of us thought through what it might or might not be, but just following on Laura's lead, they have more, her conservation district has more experience at this, and found that the management plan being part of this thing complicated it. And that's my concern at this point is, are we pushing people away because it just gets too complicated? And at what point could we simplify this whole thing to make it work simpler, easier, and get more people involved? So that's my thoughts.
Amanda?
And then Nancy.
I definitely second Doug's statement about simplifying the process to make sure we're not losing applicants or potential applicants for overcomplicating it. For my clarification, if we use the term maintenance or enhancement in a lot of the program eligibility stuff. So if not in a management plan document, where are the applicants describing those enhancements as part of this process?
I think that's a great kind of question, and Nancy will get to you, but so I think that's why it's important to look at the language of maintenance and enhancement, because typically, like, speaking to maintenance of conservation values on the property are one of the best ways for an easement to kind of talk through, like, the terms in the easement themselves are where you're setting out the land uses that essentially would, if complied with, be maintaining the values as they are. Enhancement is something where you would essentially be adding affirmative obligations into a conservation easement document that is not always the preferred approach in conservation easements, because that does take a tool that's, a property interest and turns it into more of a prescriptive management plan. So I think what is an interesting balance to try and strike is if we have an application that comes in and says this property is amazing, this easement is going to protect all these resources, and there's all this enhancement that's going to take place that will also be part of the project that OWEB is funding and the significance of that property, then it might be more appropriate to have a management plan that outside of the easement document is describing what those enhancement activities are. So I think it's a really good question to talk about. The program is asking to support the maintenance and the enhancement of these other, agricultural values, but also fish and wildlife, water quality, and other natural resource values. And so I do think it's an important consideration to think about. If we have an application that comes in and talks significantly about enhancement of a landscape, how do we want to make sure that those promises presented in an application are carried forward? And so I think a management plan can be a tool similar to how NRCS uses them. If there's a resource that being specifically called out, they will utilize a management plan in those certain parameters. But so I think that's a good consideration. There's other ways to work through management plans than specifically referencing them in the easement document. But it's a good question about where does the enhancement come in?
Awesome. And then Nancy.
I want you to notice I figured out how to raise my hand on this meeting finally. I guess I have two comments. One is that in my experience, some land trust as holders use a management plan with the landowner as a communication tool to talk about what the plan is going forward and to have a conversation on an annual basis about what's going to happen on the property to achieve the purposes of the conservation easement. What is problematic to me is the funder oversight of the management plans, because I think that impedes interest in the program, that concern that the landowner and the land trust can't be nimble in responding to changing conditions on the property, and have to have concerns about funder oversight of changes in any management plan. So if we have reference to management plan, if there's I think eliminating the OWEB review and approval would be important. And then sort of separately, on the stewardship definition, I support the broader definition rather than the LTA limitation, because I have seen land trusts as holders actively involved in some restoration aspects of a conservation easement, and to have stewardship funding available for that type of work, I think would be important to these programs.
Great. Thanks for that, Nancy. Laura.
All right. I appreciate this. I think it's really good conversation and not surprising. As we go through more iterations of the process and the rulemaking, I think we'll find room for improvement. I would suggest, based on what Nancy and other folks have said, that we just not make management plans a requirement for OWEB. Then land trusts, SWCDs, landowners can use management plans if they seem useful for them in their project, but they aren't required to do something that doesn't feel useful, not required by OWEB to do something that doesn't feel useful for their particular project.
Okay, thanks for that, Laura. Bruce.
Yeah. Can I just one more thing? I was also going to say to the conservation values, I think there's a lot of ways to enhance conservation values in an easement, right? You can have setbacks. I mean, just the fact of an easement to reduce a development right or to not have it divided, like that is all enhancement moving forward. So I just want to, and maybe I misunderstood the point that was made, but I feel very strongly that there's a ton of potential for maintenance and enhancement in conservation easements without adding a management plan.
Great. Bruce.
Yeah, I would endorse the Laura Masterson approach and whoever else was on that there with the Robin made a point that stuck with me though, that if somebody is really selling their project on the enhancement uplift part of that, maybe we could put in the guidance, and I hope that somebody's tracking things for guidance and we end up with a guidance document.
Taking good notes, promise. Yeah.
That tells people that if that's a big selling point for you, make sure, you know, that's one way to document it and get some credit for that in the review.
Awesome. Well, I think this has been really helpful. I mean, a lot of this is not so much rule and more implementation and policy, but it's really helpful to hear folks' perspective on that. Sounds like we wouldn't want to delete the definition of what we mean by management plan necessarily if we're still going to be using it sometimes and not using it others. But this is a helpful discussion. Should we move beyond it though? Renee, do you have?
Yeah, just really quickly, Taylor, going back to, I think, how Doug kicked us off with the NRCS alignment. And I don't know the program as well as Robin, but it does sound like in some instances it is a requirement for certain components of ASAP AL. So I guess just, and I'm not, I don't want to derail us, but is that something we should be contemplating in the spirit of better coordination potential? Is if yes here, then yes there, or not, because it's an unknown if someone is going to go to ASAP AL. It would just be helpful to know if we should have that as a topic to explore on this topic. Thanks.
And I can just add really quick to that, Renee, that the way ASAP AL is, they address the specific resource. So it's a grasslands management plan. It's not a like full encompassing, my understanding of it is it's not a full management plan of the entire property. It's specific to that resource. And it also has an impact on how much NRCS is contributing to the purchase price. So like a grasslands of special significance is a 75% rather than a 50% match. So I think those are also important considerations when I think about parity, is that we just aren't the same programs and our funding isn't operating the same. So just keep that in context. But I do think there's ways we can look at management plans from the perspective of when might a resource be so significant or so referenced in an application that it might benefit both from the holder's perspective and ours.
Thanks.
And then Laura.
I guess I would like, I mean, it seems to me like this is an issue for the rules, and I would like to see, and I feel like I'm hearing other commission members on board with this. What are the, I'd love to see staff come back and show us what the rules look like if we're not requiring, if OWEB is no longer requiring the management plan. I think that would be really helpful thing to be able to respond to.
Okay. Yeah, we will try and highlight that in the updated version, but I think it's here in definitions and then it's down in evaluation criteria. Should we move on?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of bring it back to stewardship and stewardship fund. Commentary from Nancy was hoping to, or suggesting to maintain this kind of broader definition of stewardship and stewardship fund. And so I think as we go down, just keep that in mind, other references of stewardship in particular, like use of grant funds, because stewardship fund is specifically called out there. So we'll move forward from there. Okay. Eligible applicants, essentially, we just wanted to clarify for folks, in case you don't always feel like chasing down other statutory references of what holders are defined as in 271.715. And so that's a whole long list, including land trusts, conservation districts, other government entities, including cities and counties. And then Indian tribes are also called out specifically as a holder for conservation easements in Oregon. So no edits there, just making sure that everyone understands that that is the conservation easement enabling statute, that kind of all conservation easements have to fall in line with when it's in reference to what is a holder. And that our program is following that logic. Okay, eligible properties. Again, we didn't make suggested edits here, but this is one of those areas where we wanted to call out that there's kind of different definitions swirling around throughout the program rules. And so we have here working lands defined in this kind of under eligible properties of what a working land is. And it's referring back to our program statute and the definition of working land there. We then have a definition of working land within the rules under Division 5 that is different. And so I think, you know, there may have been a reason at the time of the drafting of these rules as to why this definition under eligible properties refers back to a certain statutory provision and the other definition does not. But outside of having that context, if we don't have commissioners that are able to kind of rack their brains and figure that out, we do think that it's valuable to have consistent uses of definitions throughout the program. And so we are suggesting that when we are referencing working lands, we are defining them the way our statute does. And going from there, unless some, you know, the RAC has reasons, compelling reasons that to kind of continue down this path of having differentiating definitions throughout. So I can go into a little bit more depth on what those definitions are, unless others have thoughts immediately off the bat. Because this kind of goes back to more of making edits in Division 5 than making an edit in this division.
So this is maybe a plea to those folks who were around during initial program stand-up and rulemaking. Do you recall a rationale for this?
I have no memory of that.
I would agree. I don't understand why we would have done that either. So let's straighten it out.
Okay, so maybe we'll make those edits in Division 5 and we'll just revisit those at the next meeting, highlight what we did.
Great. Okay, moving down into application requirements, we just made another edit here to turn this into requirements to make it a little bit clear about what we're speaking to. So in this, we did suggest removing a couple of the requirements in the current rules, and then again here in 2B, we are just kind of making it a little bit more clear about what we're talking about in terms of who does what in the program administration. And so we basically just changed commission to OWEB, which is the agency, and the staff that our jobs are to do this. You all are the commission's volunteers that support us in that and obviously have feedback and a role, but ultimately staff at OWEB are the ones that do the work. So we just wanted to change those to match the roles. And then 3, 4, and 5. So these are terms that do kind of come from different places. So in 3, this is part of the statute that essentially says if there's an easement that also has a conservation management plan funded through the program, then they have to the easement has to reference that document. That's something that isn't necessarily going to be applicable to many applications, if any, at times, especially, early on. And so our suggestion here is that this is something we can deal with in a grant agreement if we have a project that meets this scenario. It's a statutory requirement, so we have to deal with it if the scenario arises, but having it as an application requirement that kind of is means that we have to ask about it in some ways rather than just being able to kind of deal with the scenario when it arises. We thought it would be clearer and cleaner to take it out at this time. And if I'm not looking at y'all, so if someone raises hand,
thumbs up.
Okay.
I see some content looking faces.
Okay. And then similarly with 4, this is this is also one where if there's background from commissioners who were there during the first rule development process as to why this came in as an application requirement, we are would love to hear it. But our suggestion here again is that, water quality, agricultural water quality management plan, area plan goals are goals. They tend to be quite broad, and having, what type of monitoring and management that might be required in an application at the time of application is a little bit challenging. And so again, this is a situation where in the application itself and how the project is described, we can deal with that in the final easement terms and a grant agreement requirement or grant condition if there's significant need around that. It's not something that's called out in statute as a requirement for applications or for the program in any capacity. Fully understand, the interest in having water quality approached, but we again think that this is something that can be dealt with through grant agreement and just easement drafting rather than in an application requirement. And Lois, I'm glad you raised your hand.
Well, that I think at the time that we were dealing with this is that it was something that we did not want to see slip under the rug, and that it doesn't even make any sense because we don't slip streams under the rug. But it was just a mark to say, okay, we cannot ignore this if in fact it is on the property that we're looking at. And so we need to make an assessment of that to make sure that it fits the criteria that we're looking for. So I think it was a kind of a red flag. Let's make sure this is handled.
Okay. Great, that's helpful. So I guess if it is a space that, you don't want to see slip by, would it be something that the grant agreement and grant conditions that are developed, by staff and our soundness and our reviewers would meet this purpose, or would you like to see it further or incorporated in the rules somewhere, just maybe not in application requirements?
Yeah, I don't know that it belongs in the application requirements. But I think we need to name it. I would hate to see it left in a void.
Maybe make a note, Taylor, when we get down to evaluation criteria, that perhaps we could talk about it there.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that one before I move us down to 5? Okay. So 5 is around the same lines as 3. Essentially, this is something that is required within the statute, that the landowner, the applicant, understand what this conservation management plan that is being referred to specifically in the easement or the easement application is talking about. Again, for an application requirement, we thought, this is laid out in statute, so we have to do it in some capacity, but does it need to be a requirement in every application that we have, this be like a rule that we have to check to make sure before we can move forward and even looking at the applications? And so if the scenario were to arise and that was presented, we would, deal with this in the grant agreement and have it be approached there rather than here specifically in the rules. Okay, I don't see any heartburn there. Great. Okay, so this one is a hypothetical. Apologies for a blank highlight with a comment, but so you'll note that in other sections of the rules, there is the provision that allows the commission or the board to fund a project in whole or in part. And so we did have that as a scenario last time around where a project received partial funding. So we wanted to kind of have a discussion with the RAC about whether a process outlined in rule to address a scenario where we have an application that was partially funded in one round and it says, all right, great, we'll come back the next round and we'll ask for more to fully kind of be able to complete this project. So if that is something the RAC finds to be worth putting in rule or describing a process, we would put it under application requirements, most likely. I think that's the best place to do it. It can also be something that is, moved to staff for kind of program guidance, but I do think it's worth having the RAC kind of talk through this type of scenario, given the power that you all have to fund a project in part. Amanda?
There's not anything specifically stating they're not eligible for future funding at this moment, right?
Correct.
Even for the same project area.
Correct, not in the rules, no.
Okay.
Or anywhere.
Would there be a good section in the existing Division 15 just to put that comment that, funding award does not render applicant ineligible for future awards?
I think, yeah, a statement like that would probably be good under like eligible projects or something up in eligibility. Or use of grant funds, maybe somewhere like that. Ed?
So since we're talking hypotheticals, if you have a project that's funded, isn't there that's partially funded in one round of funding, isn't there a requirement to close the easement during a certain period of time? So how does that? Yeah.
Great question. So currently the rules speak to 18 months from the board award is when we expect projects to close. We've heard significant feedback from our current grantees as well as in other programs that 18 months is not long enough to close. And part of that has to do with appraisal not necessarily appraisal requirements, but availability of appraisers and the timeline to do those. And then just other aspects in terms of NRCS timelines aligning with OWEB timelines. So we at the last, not RAC meeting, but at the last commission meeting, we did propose a staff recommendation to extend all of our current projects just because they're all running up against complications in terms of aligning funding timelines and getting through just basic due diligence at not necessarily any fault of anybody, just the way these projects play out, particularly in easements where you're dealing with another party, which is landowners. And so yes, there is an 18-month expectation, but the reality of that has definitely been something we've heard loud and clear from our applicants and our grantees.
Right. So I think by creating an expectation that you can get partial funded one round, come back for more, might make things really complicated with our closing deadlines and trying to get projects to completion.
Yeah.
I see Bruce and Renee. I don't know. I wasn't watching.
Bruce.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out, Ed. I think that's good. I'm also struggling with how you would evaluate the same project coming back and trying to sort out, at least in my mind, what have we already committed funding to versus what are we getting here? The alternative, people can withdraw the project proposal. We didn't get enough money, and come back with a phased approach to try to get it in more manageable chunks. I just see it being difficult to try to sort out what values we have already contributed funding toward and what we're being asked to fund in a second or third go around.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bruce. My comment was just going to be, as staff were thinking through the scenario, just understanding thus far with the program, we have been in a resource constrained environment. So, and we had the conversation with the commission during one of your business meetings about, are there certain things that you would like to see more geographic diversity, as an example, a diversity of kind of mixes of ag use and conservation values that are protected. And so knowing that, if we are if we're silent on this situation and we don't have $50 million in the program, we could bump into this, maybe not infrequently, and just wanting to provide the amount of guidance that we're able to for applicants so that they understand what they are entering into. Can we even do this? If we do this, I think, Bruce, to your point, if you're struggling with, well, what would we assess them on? Just trying to get clarity around that so that it's clear what the rules of the road are.
And I see Laura has her hand up.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the ASAP-AL is 3 years with a possible 2-year extension. I mean, it's just acknowledging these things take time. So I don't know. I can't remember what was proposed for the extension, but maybe we want to talk about like where's that in rule and can we do that? Because I think 18 months was awfully ambitious and probably wherever that is in rule, we probably want to change it.
Yeah, we can make a note that is quite a ways down in 15. So if we get there today, we'll go and have that conversation. But yeah, it is in rule that 18 months. So
I just have a comment. I see this if we worked ahead and left this in, I see this becoming a real headache, depending on, okay, now which part of the property was in the first one, what part of the property did you want another one on, and where does the division come in between the two of them if you're looking at the valuable assets. So I think this might turn out to be kind of a headache if we allow someone to ask for additional money on some property that's already been funded. Just a comment.
I'm hearing a mix of things, kind of one, reevaluating our just timeline to close, and how that interacts, but then also, you know, even if they're still within that timeline and struggling to find enough funds to make up the gap for the partial award that they received, how to work through that. So maybe we put a pin in this and come back with some suggestions in next time, since I think that I see a thumbs up from Bruce. So okay. Then moving on to, where are we? Matching contributions. So not much changed here. So currently we have a 25% match requirement, and so we are making no suggested edits to that. Most of the changes here are pretty much just clarifying language. So you'll see we in 2C donated portion of the sale, we just added of a conservation easement or covenant to make it clear that that's what we're talking about, is a contribution towards this this project. And then similarly under funding commitments, having that be part of the project rather than just kind of this broad, just to make it clear to folks what we're really talking about under matching contributions. And then capitalizing stewardship fund, since it's a defined term. Okay, use of grant funds. We did, so in 1A and B, made some changes here that essentially we would ultimately not have a B. It would just be, and then we'd recraft this, it would probably just be a 1 rather than a 1A or B. But right now, the way it's written, A and B, A speaks to the purchase price and appraisal requirements for an easement, and B speaks to how a covenant will be evaluated. We got some commentary and just in our own review looking at the language in B where it says using methodologies similar to those described in A. It doesn't really give much description as to, you know, if it's similar, then why not just use the appraisal standards? Appraisal USPAP is perfectly applicable to covenants as well. And so we are just suggesting that both easements and covenants be treated the same way and how their valuation is determined. So there we go.
Bruce.
You're
But
muted.
you're muted, Bruce.
Sorry. Do we say somewhere that you can't pay more than appraised value? This just talks about that it needs to be based on, purchase price needs to be based on an appraisal. It doesn't say shall not exceed or.
I don't believe that it does state that. So we can add that language in here to make that clear.
Are we sure that we want to do that? Appraisals have been all over the map, and there might be reasons to go a little bit above in some cases. I kind of like the language that we have.
So Renee, maybe you can speak to this too, just in terms of, you know, in practice and from the state perspective, we don't pay and we would not contribute more than what a easement appraises at. So regardless of the language in the rule, as you know, the state contributing the funds, we can't. And that's based off of using public resources for kind of unsubstantiated personal gain. But I don't know, Renee, if you wanted to go into more detail on.
I think that you captured it exactly correctly, and I was scrolling through the rules to check. I need to look to see. I would be surprised if it's not in there because that is our reality in terms of inability to pay above appraised value. So we should, I want to check that and then we can circle back on it. Laura, I would be, so is that something that the district has done? Has had the flexibility to pay above appraised value despite being a public body?
I'd have to go back and check. But I think there have been cases where we've talked about it, and I'm pretty sure that is an option at Metro. Yeah, I think, appraisals for conservation easements are, they are what they are here. So, anyway, I'd be happy to get back to you in the next one, but yeah, at the next meeting or before the next meeting, I can get back to you and let you know. But yeah,
let's connect up offline. We'll run the trap lines on the rule language and I think state accounting procedures, and then we can connect up before the next meeting and update the RAC.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we'll put a pin in A and B there.
Mm-hmm.
And come back to that. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, seeing none. Again, 6 is just specifying whose legal fees the grant funds can be used to pay for, and in regards to what. And then I think 8 is a good place to hold for a second. We're suggesting deleting this as a cost for a couple of reasons. One, it goes back to the conversation earlier we had about what is the role of a holder and what we're funding when it comes to conservation easements. And again, Nancy had a good point regarding the some holders do choose to engage more, have bigger involvement with kind of maintenance and management activities on land that they have an easement on than others. But we're suggesting, so this one, because it's a little bit of unclear as to what securing and maintaining the agricultural and conservation values associated with the property actually means. And it also references doing that in accordance with a conservation management plan. So if you think over to the conservation management plan program, that is, we have kind of a two-part there, and Taylor can correct me if I do this wrong, but essentially that program pays for the development of a conservation management plan, which has its own set of requirements and is laid out in rule and statute, and then also the implementation of those practices. So here we have basically a duplicity of costs that we would pay under 2 different programs, but could get really wonky in terms of application of you have the conservation management plan program paying for the implementation of practices where you also have that as an allowable cost under the conservation covenants and easements. And so thinking kind of also broader context of, as Renee mentioned earlier, we tend to be in a resource constrained scenario when it comes to the funds that we have available for this program. So thinking about what we want and what is the most important part of a conservation covenant or easement project to pay for. This was one that we thought, one, is confusing. It confuses 2 grant programs. And then also it could potentially be a large request that would reduce what is available for the purchase price, like the funds available for purchasing easements through the program. So we'll put that out there and love to hear thoughts if folks have them. And so I guess seeing no questions, is anyone opposed or have significant concerns with this current version not having this as a use of grant funds? Okay, and I'll move on quickly to 9 because I think 9 can give the space to talk about what we can provide and could be offering to help support holders in stewarding their conservation easements that are funded through this program. So we have a statement here that says use of grant funds can be used for up to 50% match for the value of a stewardship fund. We talked about what is a stewardship fund earlier. And then we have the cap for what that kind of stewardship fund can be based on 5% of the total appraised value of the covenant or easement. And so there's a couple of just kind of practical considerations that raised our eyebrows on this. Of one, a stewardship fund is it's a fund. And so we would essentially need to be given kind of verification of what the stewardship fund is, that the holder is, for us to actually, determine that the 50%, they're only asking for 50% of this fund. It just gets a little, we have to know what that fund is. And then second, the tying the cap to the appraised value is a little bit of a head scratcher, just in terms of, understanding that there was some desire to have it capped from some perspective, but the cost of stewardship is not necessarily tied to how expensive an easement is. We could have a very expensive conservation easement that has potentially limited stewardship, not limited, but not significant stewardship complications from a monitoring and enforcement perspective. So we did want to revisit this and just have a conversation with folks about, is there another way to define what the program might contribute in terms of to the stewardship fund for the easement. Bruce?
I don't recall specifically. I assume we were trying to incentivize people to actually have a stewardship fund that would make us feel better about maintenance of the easement there. Has anybody asked us to fund that?
Yeah, so we've gotten asks around this. I think it's interesting to consider too that like a stewardship fund is usually a bigger fund with pooled resources, so it's not like specific to one easement. So we could potentially talk about this, because I could say some stewardship funds are millions of dollars. And so do we want to be contributing? But we could ask folks to, provide us with their stewardship costs specific to that easement, and we could contribute up to 50% of the costs for that easement or something like that. Laura, unless Bruce has follow-up.
No, that's one I'd like you to fix somewhere.
Okay.
Okay, I think I have, I have a couple of questions about this. One is, it sounds like right now we're not, the OWEB money can't pay for any overhead or indirect costs for the stewardship fund. So I like what you just said. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the OWEB funds to contribute to stewardship of the grant that is being funded. Those are real costs of doing stewardship, and not putting them in or not being able to put them in just seems irresponsible and complicated for the land trust to just track all that. So it seems like, maybe we just want to strike the language that says that OWEB can't pay or won't pay for indirect or overhead stewardship costs. That seems like maybe the easiest way to go about it. But I'm open to other suggestions that help us fund this.
Great. And so Laura's referring back to the definition of stewardship fund and definitions. So we could work through that.
Does that not solve this question you were asking?
No, I think you're right. I think that how we define stewardship fund is exactly kind of tied to how we want to describe what we pay for here. I think the other question though, Laura, and if you have thoughts on it, is do we want to have this may not exceed 5% of the total appraised value, or find some other cap or not cap at all if it's tied directly to that easement itself?
Yeah, there has to be sort of best practices around this. So I'm happy to talk to you guys offline and see if we can just figure out what the best way is to do this. I mean, 5% seems low. Yeah, so anyway, I'm happy to talk to folks at the district, and it seems like Colt might have thoughts about this. But yeah, 5% seems really low. So hopefully we can find a way to go up from that and be sort of reasonable best practices.
I'm going to jump in, Taylor. You didn't
Yep.
call me. So I think one question that we had as staff, none of us having been here at this time, was the 5% was included. I think probably, as Bruce said, to encourage folks to have a stewardship fund. And I think the question, which again, we're probably asking folks to hark back 5+ years, is was there some intention around 5% because of concern that too many resources would be going into a stewardship fund as opposed to funding projects? Or do any of you recall a discussion about that would help inform this? And not saying we have to stick with something because it's been this way, but just trying to understand that's a very specific number. And if there are any insights from that past conversation.
This is Doug, and I don't remember why we did that, but Lois probably has a much better memory than I.
Oh, yeah, try it. No, I honestly do not remember why this particular scenario was addressed this way, as far as the 5%, et cetera, et cetera. I really do not remember a lot of discussion about it. So I guess I don't have a feeling one way or another, but I do have to say that I agree with Laura that if 5% seems rather low. But as far as what we were doing at the time that this was written up, sorry, no, I don't remember. So.
Okay, so what I'm hearing on this is kind of revisit the definition of stewardship fund in the context of use of grant funds, and then do a little bit more maybe research as to kind of best practices and around how we want to speak to how much the program will pay and contribute to a stewardship fund for an easement. So we'll kind of put a pin in this one and come back with some more details and suggestions next time around.
That would make sense, Robin, because things have changed over the years too.
Yeah, great point.
You know, how much will 5% pay for compared to what it did at one point? So I think, yeah, taking another look at it is probably a very good idea.
Okay. Thanks. So we'll skip past terms of covenants and easements. So I do want to just point a clarification there in case folks have thoughts. You're welcome to bring up comments in spaces that we didn't, but when this one, the title terms of covenants and easements, it's referring to the duration in terms, not specific terms to be included in an easement or a covenant. So just wanted to make sure everyone understood that and let you know that if you did have thoughts there, please stop us as we breeze right by it. Okay, seeing none, we'll get to the one that'll probably take us to the end of this meeting. So as you know, you all know, the evaluation criteria are really the hurdle in a lot of ways that our applicants have to grapple with, and staff and you or the commission when it comes to, you know, getting grants through to an award. So we did a lot of reworking of this. In your materials, we provided the marked up version. We also provided a clean version of just the evaluation criteria, so you could look through what it would look like with the suggested edits as we had it. We did want to make sure folks knew where space was to make adjustments and where things were already spoken to in statute, because there are things that statute says we have to use as part of our evaluation criteria for this, but you know, the RAC and in the rules for these, we can elaborate on so that our grantees and everybody who has to work with these understand and have a better concept of what we mean when we're talking about certain criteria here. And then another thing to point out is that not reflected here necessarily, but the statute speaks to the evaluation criteria that has to be used for the conservation covenants and easement grants, as well as conservation management plan grants. So they're kind of big lumping headers are for both those grants. And so this is the opportunity for the RAC to describe what those criteria mean in the context of a conservation covenant and easement grant application. So with that, do we want to move over to the clean one first and just kind of look at that one while we're describing the track changes, or do you all feel like you've got them? How would you like to work through this section, I guess?
Amanda?
I like the marked up one because it helps me keep track of what it is we're trying to add and change. Personally, other people might have a different opinion, and I'll wait to hear other people's opinions before I make my comment on item 1, 2.
I'm good with that. Let's do the marked up.
Yeah, we can always switch over to the clean version at some point if it gets too confusing.
All right, great. Amanda, start us off.
Okay. I have a general question and then a specific comment about your comment on part 1. When we talk about evaluation criteria, you know, in general, I like the list. I like the components of it. What I'm curious on is if there's a rubric associated with it in terms of, like, you know, an application could include all of these components, but how are you arriving at the ranking of one application over the other unless there's like a rubric, and I just haven't seen that document?
So great question. And there is not a rubric. I think the RAC members who were part of this process might be able to speak to kind of why, like, a specific like scoring component or weighting of criteria were not included in the first round, but that's something that's not present. So essentially all criteria are evaluated in the context of each other. For each application, you know, the review team for those applications looks at them in the context of all of it. We do our soundness and capacity reviews, and then essentially those evaluations go to the commission, and it's more of a holistic description before the funding recommendation. We did make some clarifying edits to the evaluation process and ranking process down below, which we think will kind of maybe help. But currently the evaluation criteria do not have any accompanying rubric.
And there's not like different weight given to different components either.
No. So if that is something that would be valuable or helpful, this is the space for folks to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of like avoiding subjectivity and keeping it an objective assessment and not just people's opinions on stuff, I would like to see some kind of weight assigned to different things, which doesn't have to be addressed here today, but just in future conversation. That was something that I've been thinking about, and I'm excited to hear what other commission members, what other RAC members have from historical experience with this process. And I would just wrap up my ramblings by my comment on the part one, where you say we're struggling with how to evaluate regional significance. A suggestion or an idea that I had was to make the comment demonstrated significance, put some of the onus on the applicant to demonstrate what that significance is.
Great. Thanks for that.
This is Doug. I know why we did not put significance on any of those issues is because in our discussions, the lands in the different regions of the state are so different that we felt a important part in Western Oregon or close to the metro area was not something that should be weighted the same if you're in Eastern Oregon down in Lake County, for example. And so that is why we did not put any more weight or importance on some of those issues compared to others. And I still think that trying to evaluate a piece of property in Lake County and a piece of property in Multnomah County is so different that you got to do it. You can't weight the same factors. They're just going to be different.
Thanks for that context, Doug. Renee?
Just a quick follow on. So I want to contextualize this a bit. The approach that OAHP rules and the commission and the review process is taken is not different in terms of there is not a scoring process used across OWEB programs. And I think partly what Doug just described is exactly that, especially for a statewide program. So I think just considering a formulaic nature, that's a really important conversation for this group, because that is different from how we've handled it, so as not to somehow lose value in comparing apples to oranges to cantaloupe. So I just wanted to flag that piece. It's not to say that it's an impossibility, but just thinking through the diversity across the state and then the dual benefit nature of the program from the outset in statute and going through rulemaking and program implementation, the balancing of agricultural values and protecting those values with fish and wildlife habitat, with water quality, with other natural resource considerations. So just wanted to flag some of that in the larger OWEB context. And I do think some of what led the program to end up here, why it's not a Department of Ag, why it's not an ODFW, was just some of the balancing across those different considerations and values. Thanks.
Awesome. Bruce and then Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I think we talked about this philosophical foundation here at great length way back when, and we struggled with it a lot. But I think where we ended up, going back to the word you wanted to insert there, demonstrated, we ended up landing, and I think there was a fair amount of consensus around that. We decided to put the burden on the applicant to demonstrate to us why their project is just so good, you can't not fund it. And it's partly because the complexities in trying to lay out a decision tree, a formal decision tree, if this, then that, go back to the beginning. Things like project that on paper scores really high on all the things that we think are most important, but fails the transaction legal soundness test, which you're probably not going to make that a majority point question under any construct, but it's kind of a fatal flaw if you get there. So unless you're establishing thresholds that people have to get over before you actually take a quantitative approach, it's a real challenge. So, I think it was intended to be a holistic thing for all the reasons that Doug articulated there, that it is such a diverse state. And, I think we ended up the last time we went through this, different people view these things differently. And if we can put a finer point on it, I think we should. But I have reviewed certainly more than 1,000 grant applications over the years. And the more complicated and rigid the scoring system got, particularly if you're dealing with a lot of applications, each 30 pages in length or something, I ended up reviewing them most often in that more holistic way, adding things up sort of mentally, and articulating in my own mind what it is that is most important, where the weaknesses are. And to be honest, they end up usually being kind of high, medium, and low with some gradations in between. The numerical stuff, when I have seen it, more often than not led to unintended and unsupportable outcomes in the score.
Laura.
Thank you. I agree with a lot of what's been said, and I was there for a lot of these initial conversations. And so, and I think if we could create a little more clarity for the applicants, that might be helpful. What maybe I'm missing something, but what I feel is not clear in here is just, this is an, let's see here. I guess the first thing is the regional significance. I support that one, and I think that's a great way of wording it. The extent to which working lands would protect and enhance farming, I think is great. Number two, but I've heard from applicants that it isn't clear how we're weighting these different things. And I don't know, I guess I feel like it'd be helpful to have a little bit of more guidance for folks. Because I think, there are great projects that are going to come to us that aren't near a stream. They don't have sage grouse. So they might be low on habitat and wildlife quality, but they're super high on these other things. Are we still going to fund them? To me, the answer is yes, but that's not clear in this evaluation criteria.
Thanks. Amanda.
I just want to thank everybody for their perspectives and background on this question. As a rural Eastern Oregonian, I definitely feel the regional significance to awarded grant funds and wanting to make sure that all parts of the state are evaluated fairly. And I guess that was the main point of my question, is just how we are going to maintain a perception of fairness and equality in the evaluation of these projects. And that's the only reason why I ask about like a weighting or a rubric in terms of that. So thank you all.
So I think before we move on from one in this conversation, we did suggest moving some other sub-criteria into one to kind of help describe potentially what that significance how we can look at that significance and to give that direction to applicants as to kind of how we'll be looking at their, description of why something is significant or not. So do we want to do that, or do we want to just keep charging away and do that later? Because
it's just easier to see that in the clean document.
Yeah.
Which I could pull up real quick, but we are running pretty short on time because we need to get to public comment.
Yeah, and I think regardless, so working through to the conversation about how an easement would protect, maintain, or enhance farming or ranching on the working land. We have, some pretty basic things here of not suggesting changing anything about the easements approach to reducing future conversion or fragmentation. And then similarly, we did make a couple suggested edit to B for maintaining or enhancing the ability of the land to be in productive agricultural use. Then we just tied that to use that can support a viable agricultural operation. Kind of trying to tie the easement itself to not just productive agricultural, but that it helps support that viability aspect of the program too.
So Robin, this is Doug, and that's probably where I'm having the most heartburn right now of this whole meeting. When you say support a viable agricultural operation, I think of that parcel being able to be operated by itself. And I know, at least in my operation, I have no parcels that would be make a viable agricultural operation by itself. It's because I farm 15 different parcels, and together they support a viable agricultural operation, but individually none of them would. And they're all different. Most of them are different ownerships because I long-term lease a lot of these properties. And so what you're telling me there is if it's not able to support a viable operation by itself, that we're not going to consider it. And don't think that's where we've been. I think that's a huge change.
Yep. Thank you for that, Doug, because that is not, I think we were attempting to do the opposite there. So it's good to have you reflect on how that reads to you, because for us it's that, I think it's more of that, and so maybe support is not the best word, but more the contribution that the land is that the easement's not having some impact on the land to where it no longer supports that land's contribution. So
I don't know how to word that, but if you can figure out a way to word that,
yeah,
I'd love to see it. But that I can agree with. But boy, that wording right there gives me a lot of heartburn.
Yeah, that's great. That's why you're here to help us find these spaces.
Renee?
Yeah, I want to ask a quick process question because we are getting short on time and we have at least 3 folks who are with us. I don't know if they're intending to provide verbal comment, but Eric Hartstein, is it allowable within the RAC context for RAC members to follow up with us with like exactly what Doug did? I think you're saying this, and I'm not comfortable with this, so that we can get clear on how the proposed edits are reading for folks, and if there, maybe some language that's misaligned with intent, because I do think we need to, at the next meeting, come back, start here, and I think really spend some time, maybe even pulling up and saying, okay, relative to what's in statute, what is it we're aiming for with this program? What are the 5 key things? And we can then think about some binning underneath that. But I would really hope that if there are some crossed wires, we can get clear on that before the next meeting. But Hartstein, is that an allowable communication process in between RAC meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Renee. It is. You can definitely talk to RAC members offline, and then when you bring it back to the next meeting, just make sure you say, hey, we talked about this, and you know, this is the direction we propose based on this conversation that we had with so-and-so RAC member.
Okay. And to be clear, I'm not proposing to squelch or minimize the depth of the conversation, but just like the example that Doug gave was really helpful, and maybe we can run some trap lines and then come back and have a more focused conversation after working some of the kinks out of proposed language. Thanks, Taylor.
Yep. And then Bruce.
Yeah, I think I can probably hold it till the next one. I just wasn't clear whether Doug was saying we ought to delete that, because we do talk about, you know, in B, about its ability to support a viable agricultural operation, which to me is a better way of putting it. I would take this out, but I don't know if that's what Doug was talking about, and we don't have to address it right now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we will be coming back to this at our next meeting because we are out of time. So we can talk about logistics for the next iteration of this RAC following public comment. We'll have a couple of minutes to do that. But we are running a few minutes behind, and I want to be respectful of folks who showed up to give public comment. So if there's no objections, I think let's roll into public comment. So Nicole, you want to facilitate that?
Yes, I can. If anybody is on the Zoom call that would like to provide public comment, please raise your Zoom hand now, and then I will allow you to talk via Zoom. Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Okay, we have Ivor Kincaid. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Did that work?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, a bunch of our things were covered, so I'll keep this really brief. And just I wanted to say thanks for everybody participating in this. A lot of OWEB staff and all of the board members. It's really great to have this opportunity. I'll just mention that we're going to run through like we shortened it down to 4 points. You guys covered the management plan. We welcome those proposed changes to create flexibility. That's great. And we're happy to provide any kind of definition from OAT staff to like participate if needed for the definitions. We also feel like the public meetings in a grant application, this really, we feel like is kind of an odd and unrealistic thing. Once something is funded, perhaps that makes a little more sense. Certainly if, you're proposing activities that are going to require permitting and have effects on, neighbors or communities, that might make more sense. But we're kind of thinking that like that could be removed altogether. And then this climate change evaluation and criteria, we fully understand that, this is a new requirement to include, and we get that. But as you consider the rulemaking part, we were kind of wondering with maybe, and we do support this, by the way, we're just wondering, maybe recommending against including it for this round until, you can create a little more clarification on kind of how this is going to play out. We just feel like the program should be inclusive to all kinds of ag operations at this time, and that's probably going to be best. The stewardship fund is sort of similar to management plan. I was thinking that, it sounds like you guys are kind of revisiting that, and that's great. We support that. And we're hoping that, if you reach out to COLT members or COLT as an organization, we'd also like to contribute, if possible, to provide our perspective on the costs and function of stewardship funding. In our minds, it's a pretty specific thing, and it's also complex, but we'd love to help with that if possible. And then generally, with this evaluation criteria work you guys are considering, is that it? Is that 3? We just think that some kind of points would be helpful to know, so that we can sort of pre-score projects on the front end. And that's what I got.
You're muted, Nicole.
Okay, thank you. I'll just mime it. Is there anyone else as an attendee that would like to provide public comment right now? Please raise your hand. No, thank you so much for providing it, and that's all. Thank you.
Okay, well, here we are. We have 5 minutes.
Hey, Taylor.
Yeah.
Just briefly, do we want to just do a quick summation of the written comment?
Sure.
We often do that at a RAC. I don't know if anyone's teed up. If not, I'm happy to.
I
don't know. Yeah, I can do it. So we did get some other written public comment. I think we had shared 2 different letters from OAT. One came in late after the first RAC meeting, but Mark had updated it, covers some of what Ivor touched on, but maybe take a peek at that too. We did get some written comment from ORCAN that was wide ranging, from purpose to definitions, to climate criteria, to GA conditions. GA conditions we haven't gotten to yet. So certainly take a look at that and let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to address. And then I do think that we may get some written comment from Colt. We did get late comment from them. Not sure if we heard back from Carson, but we'll share some feedback from Colt in advance of the next RAC meeting. Touches on some of the things again that Ivor hit on, but then also some topics that we haven't gotten to yet related to the expectations with neighboring properties. So there'll be some space for that discussion as we continue to move through the rules, but just wanted to make sure that you all saw the PDFs that were sent around to you. It's important to take into account both the written and verbal comment in the RAC process. So thanks for that, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks for summarizing, Renee.
Yep.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left before it's time to switch over to the business meeting. We did not make it through Division 15 today. I don't know if anyone's surprised about that, but I'm not. So the next proposed date for our RAC meeting is August 7th, same time, 2 o'clock. And I'm proposing on the fly here, and so Robin or Renee jump in if you think this is the wrong approach, so that we jump back in where we left off today into Division 15, start with the evaluation criteria, and move on from there. And so just want to pause for a second, see if that feels like the right approach, or if folks have a better idea. I am open to that, but
I'm comfortable with that. Eric Hartstein, are you okay with that? Knowing if we proceed through Division 15, we could do a circle back procedurally to revisit the other edits. Okay. But it looks like Bruce and Robin have feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and just a question, August 7th, is that what it's always been? I missed that. I'm sorry.
It was in a previous staff report, but it's open to debate. If you have another proposed date that would work better for you, we can.
I have 2 other conflicts at that point already, but
You do? Okay. Well,
I may not, maybe if I'm the only one, I would either find a way around it or, make sure you go ahead without me.
would the 8th work?
8th works for me, but I'm only one person.
You're a co-chair, it's important.
I think the 8th doesn't work for me. I'm looking at sorry about that.
All right. Well, how about this? How about I'll send out a doodle poll so we don't have to do this Zoom scheduling. So
That
it
would
sounds
be
like the
good.
7th is not going to work likely, but we'll see. So keep an eye out for an email and be responsive to that in the next couple days, please.
Okay, and just to be clear, this is 7th, the morning would work for me. It's just the afternoon is plugged.
Okay, that's good. Good to know. Thanks, Bruce. Robin.
Sorry, stuck in my calendar. I just wanted to, so for the next one, we will start where we left off. So folks won't expect another revised version that talks about the suggested comments and edits to what we talked about today, just so we can kind of deal with those all collectively when we're done with Division 15. Does that match everyone's expectations there? Okay. Just confirming. Thanks.
Okay. And we're running slower than we, initially thought. So we're likely going to need another couple of RAC meetings, I think, in order to get through the full rule set. And so when I send out that doodle poll, I think I'll likely send out not just for this upcoming meeting, but then at least the meeting after, if not a meeting after that. So just so folks are ready for that. Okay, well, with that, we have a couple of minutes before we start our business meeting. So I would propose that we take a 3-minute break. But if anybody has any closing thoughts, now would be the time to share them. Okay, well, let's call this RAC meeting to a close. And everybody come back here at 4 o'clock and we'll start the business.